Welcome to Sense and Sustainability, your podcast channel for sustainable procurement. We hope you like what you hear. Please go to www.iso2400.org for more information, learning resources, tools, and much more.
Hello, I'm Sean McCarthy, Director of Action Sustainability Community Interest Company. Welcome to our podcast series. We're starting to look back a little bit now and reintroduce people that we spoke to a couple of years ago and to start to understand a little more about what's happening in their lives, in their professional life from the last time that we spoke. And I'm delighted to reintroduce Star Scott. Star, hello.
Hi, Sean. How are you? Great to see you again.
And you. So, Star, we spoke a couple of years ago about some of the great work that you were doing around sustainability in lab procurement, particularly, certainly in the world of higher education. Tell us your story from last time we spoke.
So I work at the University of Georgia. I founded a program there in Sustainable Science and Green Labs, which is about bringing sustainability into our research spaces. So our science is incredibly resource intensive. And so this program that I founded, it helps make these spaces more sustainable. So at most research institutions, the lab space occupies maybe a third of your total footprint, but is actually using about 2/3 of the resources, the energy or water, and creating about that same amount of waste. So very resource intensive spaces. And not surprisingly, like in most sectors, Scope 3 is nearly 5 times higher than Scope 1 and 2 combined for the lab sciences. And so purchase goods and services, that's low-hanging fruit for sustainable and efficient action. And so, yeah, that's a big focus of ours.
So I think this was something you'd started last time we spoke. Where's it going now? Tell us about the latest that you've achieved.
Well, so we're still working on several of the same projects we discussed last time. We are still searching for the ever elusive nitrile glove safe list, which we have at least, 3 or 4 dozen people waiting for, or institutions waiting for. And, we hit so many roadblocks in that process of trying to create a list of nitrile glove providers that was creating gloves with fair labor. And that was really the big piece. We know that this supply chain is rife with human rights violations, and really doing that deep dive into creating this list so we could purchase nitrile gloves, which is the number one consumable in science and medicine. So we wanted to purchase this without harm in the items that we were buying. And so we set out to create this list. We have learned so much, Sean, and we continue to learn so much. What we don't have is the finished product, but what we do have is a tremendous amount of data that we could have never, ever predicted getting. And part of that has sent us on a kind of a new side quest, if you will, which is really teaching people. It started with teaching ourselves, and now it's outward facing, where we're trying to teach others about how to avoid greenwashing. And this is such an important piece of the sustainable procurement puzzle, right? And I know you know this, but teaching people how to be on the lookout for greenwashing, and within the sciences specifically, what questions can be asked and what methodology can be used to help avoid this. So that's been one of our focuses lately. And within that is really, like I mentioned, more of the methodology to it. And so that's what we've been focusing on. We're sharing that at the International Institute for Sustainable Laboratories conference this coming fall. Kind of a guide how to, because I will say we hit so many pitfalls during the process, and just realizing that we can't really trust these outward facing commitments that we were seeing from companies. If they have some standards, that is good, but it's not the end all be all, and we have to know how to apply the understanding of their certifications or standards. So that's one of our projects that we've been working on. I also just finished creating a framework for looking at equity within science. Part of it directly speaks to sustainable procurement, and there's a big section in there on all the things that you talk about with your listeners, everything from the resources that go into a product, where a product is created, certainly how it impacts a community or an ecosystem where it's made, and also how it impacts the community at end of life. So all of these aspects are included in that. So we're really excited about sharing that framework as well.
Brilliant. So in a nutshell, how do you avoid greenwash?
Well, it's it's a big question. So it starts by asking questions. And it starts by, it's almost like you have to put on your detector hat, right? And become kind of a sleuth to know, because if we just read the writing on the wall, it's usually very pretty and it sounds great. And so part of that is, what information can we use from our procurement systems, right? So what is auto-populating there from the providers into that system? For us, I know in some systems they see maybe a little bit more, but for us, we don't see a whole lot of certifications. So something like SA8000, we're not seeing that auto-populated into our procurement system. One way that we are able to use our auto-populated data is really looking at the distance traveled. So how far is that product traveling to us? So that's one piece. But back to the greenwashing. So we look at these certifications. We say, what certifications does a company have? But then the really important question is, as most of those social certifications are factory dependent, right? So they are only for the individual factory. And I know I reached out to you about this and we talked about this as well. But with that being factory dependent, you have to ask the question, how many factories do you have and how many of them have this certification? And that was really the big piece for us, because we had companies that said, oh, we're SA 8000 certified. We care about, social accountability. And we said, oh, that's great. And then we didn't realize until later they had 7 factories in 6 countries, and 2 of them had SA 8000 certification, and that was 8% of their total output, right? So the first is really understanding how to use the certifications and what follow-up questions to ask. Beyond that is like looking for certain red flags. And some of that is language that manufacturers use. So do they use, for example, for the ACT label, which is a sustainability certification for scientific products. And this label is great in that it promotes transparency, and that's what we need the most from our suppliers, right? But in that is also, how is that company using that label? And did they say we won an ACT label? We were awarded an ACT label. Well, an ACT label, like many of these certifications, is something that the company submits for. There is a fee for. So they're going through a process in order to get this ACT label. Anyone can receive one, and we're glad that they do, because we do want this transparency. But it doesn't mean that just by having one, they are sustainably superior in and of that itself, right? So we have to actually read what the label says. So part of it is about reading these certifications, understanding those certifications, and understanding how to apply it. So if a company is, in their public facing like PR, if it says, oh, we won the label or we were awarded the label, then that's kind of a red flag to take note of. So there's a big process here, and we do have it's kind of a decision tree process that we're following and guiding people through. And there's no hard and fast rules, but it's really, there are about 7 different criteria, and then a lot of it is your gut. And a lot of it is we may not have a completely black or white understanding after going through those criteria, but can we as a community start to make steps towards better understanding these processes overall, and also just being aware of how companies use this language surrounding sustainability.
That's fantastic. I'm sure our listeners will really appreciate your candor, because there's an issue with certification, isn't there? I mean, there are different types of certification that are scrutinized at different levels. So just because something or some organization has a certificate of some sort, it might be completely meaningless, or it might be the best certificate available. But there's also a dilemma about cost, isn't there? Because in order for an organization to be properly third-party verified, that costs money. Whether you can't ignore that. And obviously sometimes that's difficult for small businesses. So certainly what I see is a lot of sort of low-cost certification comes into into play. And, you get a certificate for something for, $500 or whatever. Well, how much really can you look into an organization's credentials or a product's credentials for $500? You can't. You can just have a superficial view. I mean, it's a little bit like if you buy a house here in the UK, you can have a full structural survey of the home and get it, done. Or for mortgage purposes, you can just have a valuation where the surveyor kind of drives by, has a look at the house and says, yeah, it's worth about that much. And you pay a small amount of money for that, and it's completely useless. It doesn't really tell you anything about the home. So there is always a dilemma, and I don't quite know how you solve that other than by really, as you say, asking a lot of questions and having a proper relationship with your supplier in which you can actually be honest with each other and talk about some of this stuff. I do see a lot of buyers around the world that they just want the certificate. Okay, tick, got the certificate, that's fine. I've done sustainable procurement. And I think you've very eloquently described, it ain't like that.
Also, Sean, I think where we're going with these questions is the collective purchasing power, right? So that is ultimately what all of these actions are moving towards. If we have enough people that are asking these questions of our suppliers, if we have enough big buyers in higher ed institutions and scientific institutions and that are asking these questions, at some point we are driving that transparency through our purchasing power. Now, whether or not we are getting clear answers or a complete understanding of how these products are made, or if we are, if we do have these kind of sustainable aspects, regardless of if that is true in this time, as long as we are collectively continue to add pressure to that, we are moving in that direction. And there's such incredible power in that collective. And really that's where we're headed here with these questions. So it's kind of one of those practices that even if it is not immediately serving us, over time will serve us more and more. Yeah, so we're excited about that. There's something else I was going to share with you, but I apologize. It's left my brain at this point. Oh, I know what I wanted to share with you. Sean, you helped us with a query that we had that was really important along the way. So we had a group that was a certification group that was claiming that they had traceability of origin based on SKUs. Do you remember me reaching out to you about this?
I do remember that, yeah.
And I reached out to you and a couple other folks who had that industry experience. And I said, I'm not sure about this, because if this were true, our sustainable procurement efforts would be revolutionized overnight. We would just have that SKU number, the stock keeping unit number, and then we would immediately all know the answer of where this product came from, exactly. We know that that's not something that we can use.
Really that simple, yes.
And I reached out to you because I thought, well, maybe there's something I'm missing here that, on the industry side is well known. And I think you checked with a couple of incredible sources and got back to me and you said, no, this is really, there's no international standard for this. This is only an internal stock keeping unit. And in fact, we can have SKUs that are the same that came from two different factories, or even two different factories in two different countries. So this idea that the SKU can be used for traceability is not accurate. And so that's something that we've kind of very gently and as compassionately as possible kind of called out as, not a tool that we can use at this time. But that was a really big piece of the puzzle. And yeah, thank you so much your team is so informed. I feel like, I know ISO 2400.org is this incredible resource for organizations who are trying to move in this direction and engage sustainable procurement. But also, you have these incredible experts who, when these really kind of one-off questions come our way, we're so grateful for your partnership and being able to reach out and inquire about some of those.
Yeah, I must admit, I didn't know the answer at all. I had to go back to the team. But then there were like three people that had worked in different sectors that all came up with slightly different answers, but basically the conclusion was actually no, it's not really going to work. But yeah, it's great to be able to do that. So just moving on a little bit to another topic which we can't ignore. You've had a change of administration in the United States, and that's given rise to an awful lot of changes. How are these issues impacting what you're trying to do?
Well, thank you for that question, Sean. It impacts our efforts tremendously, and not just at the sustainable procurement level, but at almost every level looking for sustainability and efficiency. And maybe at this point in the call we switch over and we use the word efficiency instead, because we all know that these are interchangeable words, right? But this is kind of where we're at. Number one, we have higher ed is at risk. Science is at risk. We are losing tremendous amounts of funding. We're losing tremendous amounts of workers, federal workers, state workers, scientists. We've had research projects canceled. There's a whole lot happening, and especially within science. And, what we do for sustainable procurement, the bottom line for that is really about protecting natural spaces, protecting this beautiful planet, and ensuring that we have sustainability of our natural spaces moving forward. And right now, those are very much at risk within our country. We have logging happening in national forests. So these wild spaces that are very much our birthright, which for me are really at the heart of what's driven me towards sustainability, these spaces are endangered. And so I think I mentioned to you earlier when we were off camera how important it was for these systems to remain in place. So the systems like ISO 2400.org, the systems that your company leads, all of these systems are so important because they are anchoring us and rooting us to this important work. And right now in the States, we're seeing massive changes that are quite honestly scary. And we are trying to amass logical and reasonable responses to them. But there's so many happening at once that our efforts are really divided. And so there's a lot happening here. I would make the argument that sustainable procurement and sustainable action becomes even more important, right? And in these times. So if we're looking at less resources, or we're looking at less money, these kind of things for funding, then these efforts become even more so important. But that is the message that I don't know has been widely accepted or understood yet. And so that's where we're at, is trying to share how important these things are, especially now more than ever.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, as you know, I've always believed that sustainable procurement is good procurement. Having been a procurement professional for, I don't know how long, 30 odd years, something like that. And you're right, it is to an extent changing the emphasis and the language. And you've already just said, let's talk about efficiency. What is it about using less energy and using less resources that's going to cost you more? A lot of what we try to do in sustainable procurement is all about actually procuring things more effectively and having better relationships with suppliers. And what you described there about the collective being the answer, because no one organisation is going to sort out the problem of ethical nitrile gloves or anything else for that matter. But together you can, and together if you procure together, actually you can procure a lot more efficiency. You can drive the total cost down. It's not a cost up thing. So but I understand. I've worked in various different places and certainly worked with some oil and gas companies, service companies in the States, and they do understand a different language, and you're trying to achieve the same things, but it's a question of how you package what you do. So all I can say is good luck with that. So I understand times over there.
Well, we're sharing on April 11th through the International Institute for Sustainable Laboratories. I'll be co-leading a panel that day on sustainable science and really talking about policy that is either supporting or challenging our efforts. And so we'll be kind of continuing the same conversation about why these systems are important, why this kind of group response and that the power of coming together is so important. And we'll also be talking about part of why I wanted to host this panel is because our counterparts in the EU and UK are continuing with this work very fervently, and we may or may not be interrupted in our work here. That's yet to be determined. But regardless, we need the hope of knowing that our colleagues overseas are very much continuing forward in these efforts. And that's what really gives me hope about the work that your team is doing, is that even if we have an interruption, which I hope we don't, but even if we do, we know that you're going to be moving forward and continuing forward in this work to really kind of hold it down, right? So that's what that brings us hope right now, because as you just mentioned, you've spent 30 years working towards these efforts, and when we spend our lives passionately driven by these efforts and then we're not allowed to pursue them, that feels like we're losing, right? It feels like a loss. So I think it's really important right now that we do have these global conversations. We're having these international conversations because that is really what is going to stabilize these actions moving forward, at least on our side. And hopefully one day we'll be able to repay the favor, right? So that's we've got to come together at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I keep talking about, and we really must do this, is to run a webinar through ISO 2400 on lab and medical procurement, because we've spoken to a lot of people and done quite a few podcasts with people that are in this world. And certainly, and they all talk about nitrile gloves, and they all talk about disposable items and all of those sorts of things. So I guess we need to get a panel together of people. And it's interesting as well, and you mentioned earlier about greenwash, and we discussed that. There is a lady in our network that's just finished a doctorate focusing on greenwash. So I need to introduce her to you. And also I need to get back to her and record a podcast with her as well and understand what the findings are from, you will understand being higher ed, the amount of work that's required to get to a PhD in any subject. So she's really looked at it in a lot of depth, and be an interesting lady to hear from.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, I would love to be connected with her. Thank you so much. That'd be awesome. And yeah, I agree. I think a webinar focused exclusively on scientific and medical procurement, I think, would be a real hot topic. I really do. Maybe that's something that I2SL can partner on as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We'd love to get you involved. And as I say, we've spoken to a number of people that are in this world, and they're all facing the same challenges. So let's try and get some people together to try and take the agenda forward.
Well, that's something you're really good at, Sean, is community building. And I think that's really important, especially right now.
Okay, Star, is there anything else that you'd like to mention before I do the close?
I just want to thank you for the work that y'all do, and I really feel like you're a hub for so many of us.
It's nice of you.
And so that's just so great to be connected. Yeah. So thank you for inviting me back.
So, Star, a pleasure as always to talk to you, and best of luck with your endeavours over there, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks so much. You too.
Thank you for listening to our podcast on Sense and Sustainability. Please listen out for more episodes. For more information, learning resources, tools, and much more content on sustainable procurement, go to www.iso2400.org.